Adwa, an African victory. On March 2nd, 1896, the world woke up to news that would shock and change it forever. Reports were flooding in from Ethiopia, where a decisive battle had taken place between an African army and a European army, resulting in a stunning victory for the Africans. For the European powers, it was a catastrophe beyond comprehension. This is the story of Adwa, a story of African resistance, courage, and triumph. A story that still resonates today, more than a century later. To tell the story of Adwa is to tell the story of Africa and colonization. Africa's story is one of diversity and complexity, shaped by centuries of trade, exchange, and contact with other civilizations. As the cradle of humanity, Africa gave rise to some of the world's earliest civilizations, from the ancient Egyptians to the kingdoms of Aksum, Ghana, Mali, Songhai, and much more. Africa, the cradle of mankind, is also the cradle of civilization. Scholars generally acknowledge 6 cradles of civilization, and ancient Egypt is among them. The ancient Egyptians established trading relationships with the Minoan civilization on the island of Crete in the eastern Mediterranean around 2000 BC. Africa's rich history also includes the kingdom of Aksum in modern-day Ethiopia, which rose to prominence around the 1st century AD. The Aksumite Empire was a major trading power that controlled much of modern-day Ethiopia, Eritrea, Sudan, and Yemen. In West Africa, the empires of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai thrived between the 9th and 16th centuries AD. These empires were known for their wealth, sophisticated trading networks, and advanced forms of government. Africa's engagement with Europe began with the arrival of the Greeks and Romans. The Roman Empire expanded into North Africa in the 2nd century BC and eventually controlled most of the region. The Roman Empire had extensive trading relationships with various African societies, including the Kingdom of Aksum. In the 7th century AD, Arab armies under the banner of Islam began to conquer parts of North Africa, bringing Islamic civilization into contact with African societies. This led to the establishment of the Islamic Caliphate in North Africa, which lasted until the 16th century. During this time, the Moors, led by the Berber general Tariq ibn Ziyad, captured the Iberian Peninsula in modern-day Spain and Portugal. Known as Al-Andalus, the territory became a prosperous cultural and economic center where education, the arts, and sciences flourished. The Moors ruled over Spain and Portugal from 711 AD to almost 1492. Throughout history, African civilizations have had their share of victories over European counterparts. The Kingdom of Aksum was able to resist the invading armies of the Persian Empire and the Byzantine Empire, and even defeated the Muslim armies of the Rashidun Caliphate. The Moors, led by the Berber general Tariq ibn Ziyad, captured the Iberian Peninsula in modern-day Spain and Portugal. Known as Al-Andalus, the territory became a prosperous cultural and economic center where education and the arts and sciences flourished. The Moors ruled over Spain and Portugal from 711 AD to almost 1492. In West Africa, the Songhai Empire was able to resist the expansion of the Mali Empire for many years, and later defeated the invading Moroccan armies at the Battle of Tondibi in 1591. However, the tide began to turn with the Industrial Revolution. Europe's technological advancements gave them a significant military and economic advantage over African societies, which ultimately led to the colonization of the continent. But Africa's rich history is a testament to the resilience and strength of its people. The story of Adwa, as we will see, is a powerful reminder of Africa's resistance to colonialism and the enduring legacy of its triumphs. Here is where the story of colonization begins for Africans. With the Portuguese and Spanish at the forefront, Europe embarked on the age of exploration that eventually led to the almost complete colonization of the African continent and most of the world. Starting with the Portuguese discovery and settlement of the lush and uninhabited island of Madeira, African land fell to European rule one by one. Many African kingdoms resisted with much success for a while. In the 16th century, when the Portuguese arrived on the west coast of Africa, they were met with fierce resistance from the Congo Kingdom, which had a powerful army and a well-organized administration. The Kingdom of Congo was able to fend off the Portuguese for over a century before ultimately succumbing to European domination. In the late 17th century, the Kingdom of Dahomey, located in present-day Benin, fiercely resisted European attempts at colonization. The Dahomey succeeded in fending off multiple French incursions and maintained its independence for over 2 centuries. Further south, in modern-day Angola, the Ndongo Kingdom under the leadership of Queen Nzinga put up a sustained resistance against the Portuguese for over 40 years, inflicting significant losses on their forces. Queen Nzinga was a strategic genius and a charismatic leader who inspired her people to fight fiercely for their freedom and independence. In the early 19th century, the Zulu Kingdom in present-day South Africa, under the leadership of King Shaka, resisted British colonization attempts with great success. The Zulus' highly disciplined and innovative military tactics allowed them to defeat British forces in multiple battles, including the Battle of Isandlwana in 1879, where a Zulu army decimated a British force of nearly. Similarly, in East Africa, the Maasai people resisted European colonization and settlement of their lands for over a century. The Maasai, known for their fierce warrior culture, were able to fend off both British and German colonization attempts through their highly effective guerrilla tactics and strategic alliances with neighboring tribes. And to the west, the Ashanti Empire in present-day Ghana, which waged multiple successful wars against British colonizers throughout the 19th century. These are but a few examples of the many victories of Africans over their would-be colonizers over the centuries. The Europeans were relentless in their pursuit of resources, wealth, and power. Despite these successes, however, the tide of European colonization ultimately proved too strong following the Second Industrial Revolution that started in 1870. By 1884, the scramble for Africa was in full swing with the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885. And so, the story of Adewa, a story of resistance, courage, and triumph, began to unfold, a story that still resonates today, more than a century later. Prelude to the war. In 1868, Ethiopia was left in turmoil following the death of Emperor Tewodros II. The British army, seeking to assert their dominance, ransacked his stronghold and looted priceless treasures and religious artifacts. As if that wasn't enough, they snatched Tewodros's young son and whisked him away to London, never to return to his homeland. With no clear successor to the throne, Ethiopia was left in a state of uncertainty and vulnerability. As the British troops withdraw from Ethiopia, they leave behind a bitter legacy of devastation and loss. Yet despite their destructive mission, the invaders do leave behind a legacy of sorts, a legacy of weaponry. When the British departed in haste, they left behind a significant cache of guns, much to the relief of those who remained in the war-torn country. How did this come to be? It was a matter of diplomacy, of course. On their way to Tewodros's stronghold, the British had passed through the territory of a minor nobleman who was no friend of the emperor. This wily nobleman had demanded a price for allowing the British to cross his lands unharmed, that they would respect Ethiopia's sovereignty and refrain from claiming any of its territory as their own. The British, to their credit, had agreed to this demand, and so the nobleman permitted them to pass. Thus, while Ethiopia had lost much, it had also gained something in return, the means to defend itself against future aggressors. And in gratitude for the safe passage, they left him a regiment's worth of rifles and a battery of artillery, a stockpile that this noble will use to become Emperor Johannes IV, a man who will defend Ethiopia, paving the way for its most famous king Menelik II, and his stunning victory at Adewa. During Emperor Johannes IV's 18-year rule, his mission was to unify Ethiopia, much like his predecessor Tewodros II. While he had managed to defend the country against invasions from Egypt, Italy, and Sudan, it was the Italians who posed the greatest threat. You see, in the late 19th century, the scramble for Africa was in full swing. Countries all across Europe were jostling for control over vast swathes of the continent, with each nation looking to expand its territory and secure valuable resources. And with the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869, the Horn of Africa was now easily accessible, and the Italians saw Ethiopia as a prime target. The French, meanwhile, had grabbed much of the Somali coast in a bid to possibly threaten British shipping, while the British themselves were looking for an ally in the region. Egypt had also seized a strip of the Eritrean coast in the 1870s, but by 1884, Egypt was bankrupt and effectively run by the British. At this point, the British facilitated a treaty that allowed for the evacuation of Egyptian troops, the return of an Ethiopian city that had been seized by the Egyptians, and the duty-free passage of Ethiopian goods through the biggest coastal port. Emperor Johannes IV, a devout Christian, believed that this treaty signaled a gradual move towards Ethiopia taking control of Eritrea. However, the British had other plans. They saw Italy as an attractive new European power that wanted colonial possessions and was anti-French. The British worried that if Ethiopia were to gain control of Eritrea, they would either let the French operate there or be conquered themselves. So the British switched the strip of land over to Italian control, which ultimately proved to be disastrous for Ethiopia. As Emperor Johannes IV focused on fending off foreign invasions and quelling internal unrest, the Italians continued to expand their territory into Ethiopia from Eritrea. The Ethiopian troops managed to defeat the Italian army at several battles, including the infamous Battle of Dogali in 1887, but Emperor Johannes was too preoccupied to take full advantage of these victories. Unfortunately, his reign was cut short in 1889 when he died fighting against a Sudanese invasion in his north. Menelik II, the king of Shewa province, declared himself emperor following Johannes's death. He had been patiently waiting for this moment, having played the long game for the imperial throne. Menelik II, a shrewd and strategic ruler, had always kept close contact with European leaders, but never trusted their intentions. But he knew he needed allies within Europe if his country was to survive the coming calamities. So when he finally became emperor following the death of Johannes, Menelik wasted no time in signing the Treaty of Wakhale with Italy in 1889 in the hopes of securing Ethiopia's boundaries and its right to pass through Eritrea, with the goal of stopping the fighting and establishing long-term peace with the Europeans. However, the Italians had a duplicitous nature, and they had two versions of the treaty. The Amharic version stated that Ethiopia could use the Italian government to conduct foreign relations if it chooses to, but the Italian version said it was obliged to, effectively making Ethiopia an Italian colony. Before the ink was dry, the Italians declared to the other European nations that Ethiopia was now an Italian protectorate, and all relations with Ethiopia must go through them. To most Europeans, Italy was one of the superior European races, and Ethiopia was part of the savage and barbarian continent of Africa, so they readily accepted this declaration. Menelik only discovered the difference between the Amharic and Italian versions of the treaty the next year, when foreign heads of state started returning his letters with apologies, stating that it was illegal to deal with him directly. Apparently, Menelik's translator, Ras Yosef, was working as a double agent for the Italians. Despite this setback, Menelik remained patient and focused on unifying the country. He made no overt attempt to cancel the treaty or cut ties with Italy or any other action that might lead to escalation. Instead, he launched a long and subtle diplomatic campaign against the Italians in their home turf. Ethiopian diplomats got photos of Menelik wearing a giant crucifix printed in newspapers, spreading stories about this amazing king, head of the only Christian country in Africa and a descendant of Solomon. He wrote to many of the European countries establishing diplomatic ties. He used the long-held rivalries between European nations to buy weapons and ammunition. He even wrote to the Italian opposition, gaining some sympathy for his cause. His tactics were so effective that the French, Russians, and even the Italians themselves sold him guns and ammunitions he would later use to defend his country. These tactics of winning favor abroad later became a common tactic in anti-colonial movements. It was especially successful in Russia, which maintained diplomatic contact due to being angry at the Italians for trying to cut them off from a fellow Orthodox government. Menelik's greatest strength, however, lay in his knowledge of his own country and its people. He negotiated and convinced almost all of his nobles to fight for their country. He also launched an extensive counter-espionage campaign, feeding the Italians false information about the state of the Ethiopian nation. He was able to neutralize most of the Italian spies in Ethiopia, while his local allies provided valuable intelligence on Italian movements and plans. Unbeknownst to the Italians, most of their local allies were actually working with Menelik. He used the Italians' overconfidence and underestimation of Ethiopia against them. They consistently misinformed the Italians about the conditions and capacity of the Ethiopian state. They told the Italians that the people were divided along ethnic and tribal lines, playing on their prejudice towards Africans. They told them that national morale was low when it was at its peak. They informed them that grain and food supplies are running out when Menelik was storing huge amount of grain in Wollo. They told the Italians most of the army is deserting as 100,000 strong warriors were marching north. They even told them that they would defect as soon as the battle starts. Then, in 1893, with his control of the country finally secure and securing a promise of military aid from Russia, he denounced the treaty and declared it invalid. Italy escalated, seizing a shipment of Russian rifles. Then, in 1894, it struck deep into northern Ethiopia, seizing 7,000 square miles of territory. The Italians under General Oreste Baratieri stormed in expecting to exploit regional and ethnic divisions, then overwhelm with modern firepower. Why wouldn't they? Every report they'd received was that nobles were deserting Menelik, that the emperor was ill, and that as he rallied his armies, no one came. The Italians even approached the son of Johannes, Ras Mengesha, and offered to back his claim as emperor. They had expected disgruntled rulers like Negus Tekle Haymanot of Gojam and the Sultan of Aussa to join them. But in reality, the Italian invasion had solidified Menelik's hand and created the unity that he'd sought. Even his enemies were joining, realizing this was a fight for independence. The ethnic rivalries between the Tigrians and the Amhara that the Italians were counting on did not prove to be a factor. Menelik was quick to expose the Italians' underlying contempt for all ethnic Africans, regardless of their individual backgrounds. The emperor pointed out the Italians' segregation policies in Eritrea, which applied to all ethnic Africans, not just specific groups. This revelation only served to further unite the Ethiopian people against the Italian invaders, fueling their determination to defend their country and their way of life. In December 1894, Bakhta Hagos led a rebellion against the Italians in Akele Guzai, claiming support of Ras Mengesha. Units of General Oreste Baratieri's army under Major Pietro Toselli crushed the rebellion and killed Bakhta at the Battle of Halai. The Italian army then occupied the Tigrian capital, Dewa. Baratieri suspected that Ras Mengesha would invade Eritrea and met him at the Battle of Koatit in January 1895. The victory in this campaign, along with previous victories against the Sudanese Mahdists, led the Italians to underestimate the difficulties to overcome in a campaign against Menelik. Menelik, on his part, had spent much of the previous 4 years building up a supply of modern weapons and ammunition, acquired from the French, British, and the Italians themselves, as the European colonial powers sought to keep each other's North African aspirations in check. But as the situation escalated, he was in desperate need of allies. He reached out to France for a treaty of alliance, hoping to secure support against the Italian invasion. However, the French abandoned the emperor in order to secure Italian approval of the Treaty of Vado. Despite being abandoned by all European nations in the face of the Italian invasion, Menelik did have one European ally, Russia. In 1895, a year before the war, Menelik sent his first delegation to Russia, headed by Fitarari Damtu. The newspapers in St. Petersburg wrote, "Along with the expedition, Menelik II sent his diplomatic mission to Russia, including his princes and his bishop." Many citizens of the capital came to meet the train that brought Fitarari Damciu and other members of the delegation to St. Petersburg. On the eve of war, an agreement providing military help for Ethiopia was concluded. As tensions with the Italians reached a boiling point, Emperor Menelik knew that he needed to act fast. On September 17, 1895, he issued a proclamation that would go down in history as one of the shortest and most powerful declarations of war ever recorded. With unwavering resolve, the emperor called upon the men of Shewa to join his army at Ware Ilu. God, by his goodness in hurling down my enemies and extending my empire, has preserved me until this day. Until now I have ruled by the grace of God. As we all must die, I shall not be distressed if I am killed. Nevertheless, the Almighty has never yet forsaken me, and I am confident that he will not forsake me in the future. Enemies have now come upon us to destroy our homeland and to change our religion. They have crossed the sea which God has given us for a frontier. Considering that our flocks were exterminated and our people tired, I have not wished to do anything until now. But our enemies have begun the affair by advancing and digging into the country like moles. With the help of God, I will not deliver up my country to them. Ever a patriot of my country, I have never yet wronged you, and you have yet to wrong me, and I will never give you sorrow. Today, you who are strong, give me of your strength, and you who are weak, help me by prayer and by thinking of your children, your wives, and your faith. But if through treachery you refuse to follow me, take heed. You will hate me because I will not refrain from punishing you. I swear by the Holy Virgin that I will accept no prayer for your pardon. I leave in the month of Tekemt. Men of Showa, go and wait for me at Wara Ilu. Let everyone be assembled by the middle of Tekemt. And Ethiopians could not keep large numbers of troops in the field much longer. Baratieri also didn't know the true numerical strength of the Ethiopian army he faced. So he further fortified his positions in the Tigray instead of advancing. He tried to outlast Menelik, knowing that such a big army couldn't remain in the field indefinitely. But Baratieri had issues with his unit. You see, the Kingdom of Italy had only unified in 1871. It was all of 24 years old at the time, and many of Baratieri's officers had strong regional feelings, disliking him as growing up near Austria. Also, the faltering Italian government was pushing for a big victory overseas to stoke nationalist pride. So, the Italian government ordered Baratieri to attack. Finally, on March 1st, 1896, the Italian forces made their move. Against his better judgment, Baratieri ordered his troops to march towards Menelik's camp in the pre-dawn hours. He was misinformed that the Ethiopians would be attending church and would not fight on the Sabbath. But the Italians were in for a rude awakening. They were hit by wave after wave of attacks, and soon realized they were facing an army of 100,000 strong, 10 times their size. The Ethiopians, fueled by their determination to defend their homeland, launched fierce attacks that pinned the Italian units down. But the Italians, using heavy artillery, repulsed the attacks time and again. Ethiopian forces began hesitating, including Empress Taytu's personal artillery unit. She approached the faltering troops on foot and drew back her veil, both things that were never done, mind you, and proceeded to shout them back to their guns. Soon, other women had joined her encouragement and taunting, their manhood challenged. No one dared retreat. When Menelik released his reserve of 25,000 men, the Italian brigade was completely. When the 2nd Italian brigade came to the aid of the 1st, Menelik drove between them, splitting the Italian force. When the relief brigade retreated into a canyon, Ethiopian cavalry rode them down. And by noon, Ethiopian forces had flanked and destroyed both the 3rd column and the reserve brigade. Both sides had taken heavy casualties, but of the 10,000 Italians that took the field, only 3,000 survived. Adewa was a crushing defeat and effectively ended the war. Within the year, Italy would sign a treaty formally recognizing Ethiopian independence, and the other states of Europe followed. Others saw that victory as well. Other Africans and black people across the world would look to the Battle of Adewa as inspiration and a source of pride. For not only did it show that colonial control of Africa wasn't inevitable, it proved that European claims of racial superiority were untrue. The Battle of Adewa was a turning point in the history of Ethiopia and a testament to the power of determination and unity in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. The year 1896 was a crucial year for Europe as a whole, and for Italy in particular. In that year, Italy was defeated by Ethiopia at the Battle of Adewa, signaling the end of the might is right era assumed by the European powers of the day. The red, yellow and green flag under which the people of Ethiopia marched to secure their independence became a symbol of the struggle for freedom across the world. 23 out of the 54 African states adopted the red, yellow and green flag upon gaining independence some 70 years later. The colors of the flag embody the spirit of the African people who fought for their freedom. The victory of Adewa inspired other African post-colonial movements seeking independence. Ethiopia stood alone in Africa looking to Europe for allies, but by the dawn of the 20th century, it had become a leader among fellow African states in the struggle against Europe. The defeat of Italy in Adewa was a major blow to the industrial world because it heralded the beginning of resistance against the industrial powers and the struggle for independence by the colonized African nations. After the battle, Ethiopia acquired a special importance in the eyes of Africans and black people all over the world alike, as the only surviving African state that successfully defeated a European colonial power in open battle. Ethiopia became emblematic of African valor and resistance, the bastion of prestige and hope to thousands of Africans who were experiencing the full shock of European conquest and were beginning to search for an answer to the myth of African and black inferiority. The defeat of Italy in Adewa forced them to recognize the African nation of Ethiopia as an equal and brought Italy's government to its knees, who had viewed them as an inferior barbaric race. Not surprisingly, some European artists rushed to the defense of colonialism. French artist Charles Leandre painted the caricature of Menelik that you are seeing. At the top right, the artist wrote, "The benevolent Negus takes advantage of the victory, but he never abuses it." The underlying message, of course, is that the beastly and barbarian king is going to shame Europe. In the aftermath of the war, Pope Leo XIII and King Menelik exchanged letters to effect the release of Italian prisoners of war, and the Vatican turned to the Church of Alexandria for help with mediation. Trade cards of the day reflect current event in brightly colored images. Here we see Monsignor Macaire of the Vicar of the Egyptian Coptic Church approaching Emperor Menelik on behalf of the Pope of Rome, a prudent example of religious diplomacy since the King of Kings and Monsignor Macaire both belong to the Orthodox faith. Negotiations between the two dignitaries bore results. On November 20th, 1896, the Emperor released 200 Italian POWs in honor of the Queen of Italy's birthday, and successive releases were effected in February and June of 1897, when the last of the Italian POWs left the country. Indeed, in later decades, Ethiopia would become a center for other African post-colonial movements seeking independence. First centuries, Ethiopia stood alone in Africa looking to Europe for allies, but by the dawn of the 20th century, it had become a leader among fellow African states in the struggle against Europe. The Battle of Adewa was the first defeat of a European power by an African army in modern times. Ethiopia became a symbol of African dignity and resistance. Ali Mazrui. Because of Adewa, Ethiopia became a symbol of African dignity and resistance, and the colors of its flag represented the power, faith, and hope of the African people who fought for their freedom. Today, those same colors are seen as symbols of hope, resilience, and resistance against oppression, and they continue to inspire people around the world.